They say time mends all things, but they forget to mention how quietly it can break you first. Sometimes the wounds aren't loud. They don't bleed. They just sit under your skin, waiting for a moment when you least expect them. And that's when they ache the most. He hadn't called in nearly a year. That alone should have told me something. But when the phone rang that Thursday afternoon and Brian's name lit up the screen, I felt something I hadn't in a while. A rush, the kind that makes your chest lift for a second before you even say hello. He said they were throwing a little birthday party for Sophie, my granddaughter, and they thought it'd be nice if I came. He said it like it was normal, like we hadn't spent the last few years dancing around silence. He even joked about how I should bring those sugar cookies I used to bake, the ones with the cracked edges and cinnamon glaze. It was raining lightly outside, the kind of rain that softens the world. I remember that because I stood by the window a full minute after we hung up, just holding the phone. I told myself, this was the start of something new, that maybe time really did smooth things out, eventually. Maybe being a mother wasn't always a losing game. I packed slowly that night, took out the burgundy dress I kept for nice occasions, pressed it myself, tucked in a hand-knitted scarf for Sophie, and slid in an old photo of me and Brian when he still had braces and liked holding my hand in public. That one stayed hidden in the lining of my purse, not to be given, just to be remembered. There's something about getting ready for a trip when you're older. You don't rush, you touch everything. You wonder what the house will feel like empty for a few days. You don't just prepare clothes, you prepare your heart. You walk slower through each room, pausing like the walls might ask where you're going. It's not sadness, it's ceremony. You close the fridge door softer, water the plants slower. I didn't sleep much that night, not from worry, from hope. It had been a long time since I had something to look forward to that wasn't a discount at the pharmacy or a new soup recipe. Friday morning came. I stood by the door with my coat on, suitcase upright, checking the time again. 8:13. Brian said he'd swing by around 8. Funny how, when you're waiting on someone you love, 5 minutes feels like 50. He pulled up just before 8:30, windows rolled down, music too loud for a morning. He smiled like everything was fine, like this was how things had always been. And I smiled too, because that's what mothers do. Even when they don't know what's coming next, they smile, they go. Pause. If you've ever packed more hope than clothes for a trip, you know what I mean. He pulled up near the side entrance of the train station. The sky was already bright, but the air still held that early morning hush. No traffic, no rush, just the low hum of birds and the occasional passing car. Brian leaned over and popped the trunk. I stepped out, feeling the slight sting in my knees from the sudden movement. He didn't get out with me, just stayed in the driver's seat, fingers tapping the steering wheel like he had somewhere more important to be. I reached for the suitcase and pulled it up to the curb. He rolled the window down and said he'd already picked up the ticket, told me to head inside and wait. The train would be arriving soon, said he needed to run a quick errand, grab coffee before heading to the house. Something about the new caterer being a mess. He smiled at me then, not wide, not soft, just a flicker like someone flipping on a light for a second, then shutting it off again. Before I could say anything else, he shifted into gear and pulled away. No hug, no looking back, just taillights fading down the street. I pulled the suitcase closer and walked inside the small station. It was old, not much updated since the 70s. Vinyl seats bolted into the floor, 2 vending machines humming in the corner, a wall clock that ticked louder than it should. I found the ticket counter and gave my name. The woman behind the glass typed something, frowned, then shook her head. She asked if I was sure it was purchased today. I nodded. She looked again. Then said there was no reservation under that name. I checked my purse, no paper ticket, no email confirmation. My phone was down to 3%. I didn't see a charger in my bag. I sat down near the window, suitcase upright beside me, and waited. 5 minutes, then 10, then 30. No call, no message, no Brian. I tried not to let my thoughts spin. I reminded myself he was busy. Maybe he got stuck. Maybe the ticket would show up soon. Maybe there was just a mix-up at the counter. Another hour passed. I stood up and walked outside, hoping maybe I'd see the car pulling back in, but the curb was empty. No familiar Navy SUV. Just a stray dog trotting across the lot and an older man buying a newspaper from the stand. I went back inside. The benches were harder. This time the silence louder. I sat down, pulled my coat tighter, and stared at the same clock. The second hand moved steady and smooth, like it had nowhere else to be. Unlike the person who was supposed to be here. I didn't know it yet, but I was no longer a passenger. I was the one left behind. And something about that shift, so small, yet so final, wrapped itself tight around my chest. I stayed seated for as long as I could. After another hour passed, I stood and paced the small terminal. The clerk behind the glass gave me a sideways glance, but she didn't say anything. No one did. I was just another old woman waiting for something. No one else understood. I tried Brian's number again. This time, it rang once before going straight to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. My voice felt tight in my throat. I didn't trust it to sound calm. I stepped outside. The sky had turned sharper, clouds beginning to gather near the edge of the horizon. I searched the lot again, even checked the back of the building as if Brian might suddenly appear like a bad magic trick. But there was no sign of him. Not even a trace of the car. I walked to the edge of the curb, hoping for a cab or maybe a rideshare. My phone screen was black now. Battery gone, no charger, no backup. Just me and the low hum of passing wind. I flagged down a woman who looked kind enough, asked her if I could borrow her phone for one quick call. She hesitated, but handed it over. I dialed Brian again. One ring, then a fast click. He had declined it. I gave the phone back and thanked her. She didn't ask anything, just nodded and walked off. Back inside, the bench felt harder than before. I opened my purse, checked every pocket twice. I found a $10 bill folded next to some tissues. That was all the cash I had. I hadn't packed thinking I'd need money. I had packed for a visit, not an abandonment. I wasn't supposed to be traveling alone. I looked around the room. A young man with headphones. A woman with 2 kids asleep on her lap. No one was looking at me. That might have hurt more than if they had. At least then I'd exist in someone's eyes. I sat with my hands folded in my lap, quiet and still. The clock kept ticking, that same second hand, steady and unbothered. A soft voice broke through. "You look like you could use something warm." I looked up. An older woman about my age stood holding a to-go cup. She wore a denim jacket frayed at the collar and had kind eyes. She introduced herself as Margot. Said her bookshop was across the street. Nothing fancy, just paperbacks and bad coffee, but it was warm. Said I could sit for a bit if I wanted. No pressure. I nodded. I didn't have the energy to decline. We crossed the street slowly. My suitcase wheels caught on the sidewalk cracks. Margot noticed and slowed down to match my pace. She didn't talk much after that, just led me through the front door of the shop and pointed to an old armchair by the window. She didn't ask what had happened. She just let me sit. And for the first time that day, I let myself stop pretending I was okay. The shop smelled like old pages and something faintly toasted. Not warm, not sweet, more like overbrewed tea and dust. It was quiet, but not the kind of silence that stung. This one settled around you, let you breathe in it. It wrapped around me the way a memory might, gentle, uninvited, but familiar. It felt like the kind of silence that wasn't empty, but full, like it knew how to hold someone. Margot moved behind the counter. Without a word, she turned on a small electric kettle, pulled down 2 chipped mugs from a shelf. Her hands moved slowly, but there was no shakiness in them, just age, lived in and steady. I sat in the armchair by the front window. It was deep and low, the kind that forces your spine to settle. My coat still on, purse in my lap. I didn't move much. I wasn't ready to. Margot poured tea and handed me a cup. No questions, no small talk, just the quiet kindness of someone who had clearly been there before. We sat like that for a while. I watched cars pass outside. A group of teenagers laughed loudly as they walked by, their joy so distant from where I was sitting, it felt like another country. I sipped the tea. It was bitter, the kind of bitter that grows on you if you let it. Eventually, Margot spoke, said she'd run the shop for nearly 30 years, said people didn't read like they used to, but she kept it open anyway. Something about the weight of books anchoring her in a way. Nothing else could. I nodded. I understood that. You can measure a whole life by the books you keep. She didn't ask my name, didn't ask why I was there. just talked around the silence like it was an old friend. She mentioned she once got left at a bus station in Boise. Said it wasn't the same as being forgotten. It was worse. It was being made invisible. I looked down at my hands. They didn't shake either, but they stayed clenched. My fingers pressed tight together around the ceramic mug. I had never said it out loud, but part of me feared I had become invisible too. Replaced by convenience, softened into someone they could sideline without guilt. I kept telling myself it was just a misunderstanding. But deep down I knew this wasn't sudden. It was slow, quiet erosion. And now I was sitting in the middle of it. And in that small invisible tension was the truth. Not all pain comes loud. Some just stays quiet, coiled beneath your skin. I hadn't cried. Not even at the station, but in that chair, listening to the soft creak of floorboards under Margot's steps, something inside me folded a little. She walked to a back shelf, pulled down a book and placed it beside me. Said I could read or just hold it. Said sometimes the weight of a story helped more than the story itself. The cover was worn, the title half faded, but the spine held strong. I sat there a long time. I didn't open it. I just let it rest in my lap. That small, solid thing. Something that hadn't abandoned me. By late afternoon, the sky outside turned gray. Margot handed me a blanket and told me I could stay as long as I needed. No rush, no clock. I stayed. And that night, I slept in a bookshop, with my coat on, a book unopened, and a cup still half full of cold tea. And somehow, I felt safer there than I had in a very long time. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of someone flipping pages. Margot was already at the counter, her glasses sliding low on her nose, reading something old and heavy. The shop felt warmer than the night before. Or maybe, I just did. She made oatmeal on a small hot plate behind the counter. No sugar, no milk, just plain oats and a handful of raisins. I ate quietly, every bite slow, letting the warmth spread through my chest. After I finished, she handed me a clean dish towel and nodded toward the sink. That was how we said thank you. By noon, I told her I needed to head home. She didn't ask where that was, just handed me a paper bag with 2 granola bars, a bottle of water, and a folded umbrella. Said she had a feeling the sky wasn't done yet. It wasn't. The clouds broke open halfway through the bus ride. Rain tapped the windows like it knew something I didn't. I sat near the back, my suitcase on the floor, between my feet, water pooling under the wheels. By the time I got back to my apartment, everything felt heavier. I peeled off my wet coat, set my suitcase by the door, and walked straight to the small filing cabinet in my bedroom closet. The drawer stuck a little from humidity, but I yanked it open. There in the middle folder were the papers Brian probably hoped I had forgotten about. The trust account, the one my late husband set up before his first surgery. It was supposed to go to Brian and Sophie eventually, but I was still the primary trustee. I pulled out the folder and sat at the dining table, flipping through each page. The terms were clear. Funds could only be released under my written approval. There was a clause about mental competency, a safeguard my husband insisted on after seeing what happened to his own mother. Any claim of diminished capacity required independent medical verification. I knew what Brian had tried. I had felt it for months, in the way he spoke to me, slow and patronizing, the way he double-checked things I said. How he offered to help manage my mail, handle my appointments, always with that same gentle voice that carried a quiet insult underneath. I opened the envelope tucked behind the last page. It held a recent letter from the bank. A notification Brian had submitted a request to begin partial withdrawal. He had also included a letter signed in my name authorizing the release, but it wasn't my signature. I stared at it for a long time. The loops were wrong, the slant too sharp. He had copied it from the birthday cards I used to send Sophie. He must have thought I wouldn't notice, that I wouldn't even check. I folded the papers back up, placed them neatly in a new envelope, and set it aside. He thought I was slipping. But I remembered everything, especially this. The next morning, I called Malcolm from the old landline in my kitchen. He answered on the second ring. His voice hadn't changed, still deep and steady, like someone who had spent his whole life reading contracts and catching people's mistakes. I told him I needed to come by. He didn't ask why, just gave me a time. I took the bus into the city. The rain had stopped, but everything still looked wet, sidewalks shining like someone had poured varnish over them. Malcolm's office sat in a quiet brick building, tucked between a post office and a law library. I hadn't been there since my husband's funeral. He opened the door before I even knocked. Let me in with a nod, offered me the same brown leather chair I used to sit in when we signed the first version of the trust. It squeaked the same way when I leaned back. I slid the forged letter across the desk. He didn't pick it up right away, just looked at it, then looked at me. You remember what we wrote into the original documents? I nodded. Every word. He opened the bottom drawer of his desk and pulled out a red folder marked with my husband's initials. Inside was a sealed envelope I hadn't seen before. Malcolm broke the seal and unfolded the contents. It was an addendum to the trust, signed 6 months before my husband passed. A clause that had never been triggered. It stated that if any beneficiary attempted to manipulate, falsify, or coerce the trustee in any way, the trust would be frozen immediately. Permanent disqualification, unless reinstated by unanimous vote of 2 named legal advisors, both of whom were deceased. Malcolm placed the page in front of me and tapped the paragraph with his finger. This gives us authority to act. All we need is written notice and evidence. I have the letter you brought. That's enough. He handed me a pen. I signed. He made a call to the financial institution. His tone never lifted, never dipped, just flat and calm. Stated the clause, cited the section, named me as active trustee with full control. By the time he hung up, the account was frozen. No access, no notification to Brian until reviewed. I leaned back in the chair and stared at the framed painting on the wall. A quiet forest, gold leaves, path disappearing into a soft blur. My husband had chosen it. Said it reminded him of the woods behind his childhood home. I never liked it. Too quiet, too uncertain. But that day, I understood it a little more. The blur no longer looked like uncertainty. It looked like the moment right after letting go, when everything becomes still. Malcolm slid the folder back into the drawer and locked it. He said nothing more, just walked me to the door, placed a hand on my shoulder, and waited for me to exhale. I didn't say goodbye. I just walked out. And for the first time in weeks, my steps felt like mine again. I got home that afternoon and didn't bother taking off my shoes. I went straight to the kitchen table, pulled out the envelope from Malcolm, and laid it flat beside my notepad. The bank had frozen the trust, but that wasn't enough. Not for me. I sat down, clicked the old desk lamp on, and began writing a letter, not to Brian. That part of me had already gone quiet. I wrote to the Office of the Inspector General. I listed everything. The forged signature, the false claims, the attempt to legal consent. I made sure to include the dates, names, institutions. I had no interest in drama, just truth, quiet and full. I attached copies of the forged document and Malcolm's statement, signed it all in blue ink. I sealed the envelope and slid it into my purse. The post office was only 4 blocks away, and the air that evening was sharp and still, the kind of air that makes you feel awake in a way coffee never could. I mailed the letter with a receipt. Confirmation. Watched the clerk stamp it and toss it into the canvas bin, like it wasn't holding the weight of a family breaking. I didn't flinch, I just turned and walked out. Back at home, I opened the kitchen drawer and pulled out my checkbook. I hadn't used it in months. I sat at the table and began writing small checks. One to the retirement fund I had let lapse, one to the heating company to prepay winter service, one to a local literacy group I used to volunteer with before Brian told me I was too tired to keep doing things like that. Each check felt like a small reclaiming. Not revenge, just restoration. With every stroke of the pen, I stitched something back together in myself, a quiet mending, page by page. 2 days later, Malcolm called. Brian had finally reached out. He wanted answers. Malcolm told him the truth. The trust was frozen. The documents were under investigation. There would be no access, no payout, no more quiet theft. Brian didn't call me. He didn't leave a voicemail. But I knew he heard it. The silence said more than words would have. Later that week, I went to the bank myself, not because I needed to, just because I wanted to look the teller in the eye. When I asked to confirm control of the account, she looked at the screen, then at me, and nodded. I was still the sole authorized party, still the one who decided what happened next. I walked out with the slip folded in my coat pocket. It was just a piece of paper, but my hand stayed on it all the way home, as if it might float away if I let go. That walk home felt different. Each step carried something heavier than relief. It was reclamation, wrapped in silence. That night, I had tea at the kitchen table, lights off except for the stove light. Outside, the street was quiet. Inside, my chest didn't feel tight anymore. I hadn't raised my voice, hadn't made a scene. But he no longer had access to what he thought was already his. And I had taken back what was always mine. The call came through the apartment intercom late Wednesday morning. I was folding towels on the living room couch when the buzzer rang. It startled me more than it should have. I wiped my hands and pressed the button. It was the delivery man. A large envelope from a courier service. No return address, just my name typed clean on the label. I signed without asking and took it inside. I already knew what it was before I opened it. Inside was a copy of a letter Brian had sent to the legal review board. It was defensive, filled with long paragraphs about miscommunication, misunderstanding, misplacement of responsibility. He claimed I had forgotten conversations, claimed I had confused timelines, claimed I had been declining for some time. There was no apology, just a series of careful justifications. He never used the word forgery, never acknowledged the letter he faked. Instead, he painted a portrait of himself as a worried son trying to do the right thing. Attached was a second document, a signed affidavit from a family doctor I hadn't seen in 3 years. The date had been altered. The assessment vague. Nowhere did it state incompetence, just an observation about stress, aging, and forgetfulness. Words that could bend any direction you wanted. I set the papers aside. My hands didn't shake. I had already learned what it felt like to be quietly erased. But even still, seeing it written, so carefully, so deliberately, was like being pushed out of your own reflection. What stayed with me wasn't the letter. It was what I found later that afternoon. I had stepped out for groceries, just milk, some bread, and apples. When I returned, my voicemail light was blinking. 2 messages. The first was from the clinic confirming my upcoming physical. The second was from Sophie. Her voice was cautious, quieter than I remembered. She said she had heard things, wasn't sure what was going on, but wanted to say hi. Just hi. Nothing more. She didn't leave a callback number, didn't say where she was staying, just said she missed the cookies I used to make, then hung up. It didn't sound like a message she was supposed to leave. It sounded like one she whispered when no one else was in the room. I sat at the edge of the kitchen chair, one hand still holding a grocery bag, and let her voice play twice. Then I deleted it, not out of anger, out of something deeper. A knowing. She wasn't calling for me, she was calling for a version of me that had been made distant. She didn't have all the facts, not yet. But she was beginning to see cracks. And maybe that was how the truth always started, with small fissures, quiet as breath. I returned to unpacking the groceries, set the apples in the bowl on the counter, bread in the drawer, milk in the fridge. The world hadn't stopped, but it had shifted, slightly, quietly. The kind of shift you only notice when the silence begins to stretch the wrong way. And in that stillness I understood, he wasn't in control anymore. But he hadn't realized it yet. It was Malcolm who suggested we meet in person again. He said there was something I needed to hear. Something he didn't want to say. Over the phone, we met at a diner off Union Street. The kind with cracked leather booths and waitresses who never wrote anything down. I arrived early and sat facing the door. Malcolm came in 10 minutes later, carrying a manila folder and looking more tired than usual. He slid into the seat across from me, ordered black coffee, and didn't bother with small talk. He placed the folder on the table and opened it. Inside were printed emails, dozens, most from Brian, a few from someone at the bank, one from a lawyer I didn't recognize. They all circled the same topic: access, leverage, strategy. Malcolm tapped one in particular. It was dated 2 weeks before I got that phone call about Sophie's party. In it, Brian outlined a plan to isolate me temporarily. Nothing explicit, just coded language. Words like compliance, streamlining, managing the transition. He had been planning it, not just hoping I'd fade, but actively setting it up. The invitation, the train station, the timing, none of it was accidental. Malcolm leaned back while I read. He didn't interrupt, didn't soften the truth. I closed the folder and let my hands rest on it. They felt heavier now, not from shock, but from clarity. I asked Malcolm what would happen next. He said the bank's internal review was complete, the signatures didn't match, The attempt to access funds without authorization was logged. There would be no legal pursuit unless I filed a formal complaint. I said nothing, just nodded. He added that a second financial institution had reached out. Brian had attempted to move assets using his own firm's credentials. That move was now flagged. I let the words settle in my chest. They didn't hit like betrayal. They landed like confirmation. I had known. I just hadn't seen all the edges. We sat in silence while the waitress refilled our cups. Eventually, Malcolm stood, handed me the folder, and told me to take my time. There was no rush, no deadline, just the truth, waiting whenever I was ready to use it. I walked home with the folder pressed against my chest under my coat. The air was colder than it had been in days. I didn't mind. At home, I placed the folder on the counter. I didn't open it again, not yet. I just stood for a while, coat still on, eyes on the window where the light was starting to fade. He had played every move with the confidence of someone convinced no one was watching. But I had seen enough, and now I held the final piece, the one he forgot I still had. The knock came just after 6. Not loud, just 3 short taps, like someone testing the weight of their own presence. I stayed seated on the couch, lights off except for the one over the sink. Through the peephole, I saw him, Brian, suit jacket slightly wrinkled, phone in hand, shoulders squared like he was about to deliver a pitch. For a moment I just watched, let the stillness fill the space between the door and my chest. He knocked again, this time softer. Then waited. I didn't move. Eventually I heard him sigh. He shifted from one foot to the other, then reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an envelope. Slid it under the door. Then silence. No goodbye. No footsteps down the hall, just silence. I waited 10 full minutes before picking it up. Inside was a letter, handwritten, neatly spaced, deliberate, the kind of letter people write when they think they've run out of other options. He wrote that he had made mistakes, that he had overstepped, that he thought he was protecting me from future confusion, from financial stress, from the burden of control. He never admitted what he did, just circled it. Language tidy and distant. He asked to meet, said he wanted to talk face to face, said we needed to clear the air. I folded the letter once, placed it back in the envelope, and slid it into the drawer beside my keys. I didn't plan to answer. The next morning, I walked to the notary's office. Malcolm had already prepared the updated documents. Full revocation of Brian's access, reassignment of secondary beneficiary, Sophie's name removed, for now. Malcolm said it was reversible should I ever decide otherwise. I signed each page carefully, initials steady in the margins. The notary stamped the final form, handed me the completed copy. It didn't feel like revenge. It felt like a conclusion. On the way home, I passed a bench in the park where I used to sit with Sophie when she was little. We would feed the ducks and count the leaves turning yellow in the fall. I didn't stop. I just walked past it, eyes forward. When I got home, the apartment felt lighter, not different, just cleaner, in a way only silence can bring. That evening, I made a small pot of soup, ate quietly at the kitchen table. Nothing extravagant, just lentils and carrots and rosemary from the windowsill. I didn't check the mailbox, didn't look at my phone. Some things no longer needed checking. That night, I slept without waking once. No dreams, no noise, just the quiet breath of a home no longer shared with doubt. He had finally come to see me, but I no longer needed to be seen by him. He had already taught me everything I needed to know by leaving me behind. He gave me the space to return to myself. The morning was gray but not heavy, just quiet in a way that made decisions feel easier. I dressed with care, slacks, a pressed blouse I hadn't worn in months, the necklace with the single pearl my husband gave me on our 30th anniversary. It rested lightly against my collarbone, like a memory without bitterness. I took the bus to the bank, same branch Brian used. Same building where he had smiled at the manager, passed papers across polished counters, pretended none of it was cruel. I walked in and asked for the senior associate. Gave my name. Waited. She came out within minutes. Warm smile. Hand extended. Led me to a small office with frosted glass and 2 leather chairs. She had reviewed the documents Malcolm sent. Everything was in place, no questions, just confirmations. I handed over the signed forms. Closure of the joint access, consolidation of assets under my name, redirection of the investment account, removal of all other signatories. When she asked if I wanted to leave any notifications, I shook my head. No alerts, no warnings, just finality. She stamped the last page, handed me a folder with my new statements, and thanked me for coming in person. As I walked out, I passed the teller station. A young man behind the glass smiled politely. I smiled back. He reminded me of a boy Brian used to coach in Little League. Same posture, same clean, eager look. But this one hadn't learned to pretend yet. Outside, the wind had picked up. I pulled my coat tighter, held the folder close to my chest. At the corner, I stopped at the bakery. Bought a single apple tart, still warm. The woman behind the counter wrapped it carefully, added a napkin without being asked. I thanked her and walked the long way home. I ate it at the kitchen table, watching the leaves flicker in the breeze outside the window. The taste was clean, not too sweet. The crust flaked without effort. I didn't rush. Later that afternoon, I opened a new account at a different bank. One Brian didn't know. One Sophie had never visited. It felt like drawing a new line in the sand, not to hide, just to start from where I stood. It wasn't about fear anymore. It was about space, finally having enough of it to breathe. That evening, I poured myself a glass of cold water, stood at the sink, and looked out at the street below. Cars passed, lights changed, life moved forward without asking. He had made his moves, but the final decision had never been his. And now there was nothing left to take, only what I chose to keep. A week passed. No more calls, no letters, no unexpected knocks, just stillness. The kind that doesn't echo. It just settles. I went to the bookshop again. Margot greeted me with her usual nod. No questions. No mention of the day I showed up with nothing but a suitcase and a shaken voice. She handed me a cup of tea. The same bitter kind. I didn't mind it this time. I had grown into its flavor. That bitterness now felt honest, like truth, unadorned but still warm. I sat in the same chair by the window. This time I brought a book, one I chose myself, one I had once loved but forgotten about in the noise of everything else. I read slowly, page by page, as if returning to a part of me that had waited patiently. Later, I stopped by the market, bought fresh basil, tomatoes, a small wedge of cheese. I hadn't cooked a real meal in a while. That night I did. Not for anyone else, just for me. The kitchen smelled like something new was beginning, even if it didn't have a name yet. Before bed, I opened the windows. Let the cold air in. It felt clean, like it was clearing the last of him out of the walls. The space didn't feel empty, it felt restored. I realized healing wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was just a quiet meal and an open window. I folded the old letter he wrote, the one he slid under my door, placed it in the back of the filing cabinet. Not out of sentiment, but to remind myself how far I had come. Not everything needed burning. Some things just needed to be put away. The next morning I walked through the neighborhood. The air crisp, the light soft. Dear friend, sometimes the hardest part of healing isn't the wound itself. It's accepting that the person who hurt you won't be the one to mend it. The Stoics teach us that we don't control what others do, only how we respond. That strength isn't in winning arguments or rewriting the past, but in standing quietly with your truth when no one else believes in it yet. You don't have to shout to reclaim your power. Sometimes, you just need to walk past the place where the pain began and not look back. So if you've ever been left behind, misunderstood, or quietly erased, let this story be a reminder. You are not defined by who abandoned you, but by who you chose to become after. Keep walking. Keep choosing yourself. The quiet path is still a path forward, with warmth and strength, from someone who sees you and believes you still belong to yourself. If this story touched your heart, leave a quiet below, or share it with someone who might need it. And if you'd like more stories like this, subscribe and stay a while. Your presence here matters.